Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us again for the second seminar of the summer series. I'm just going to give a really brief introduction, which is kind of the same as what I said last week or in the last seminar, as we let more people join a little bit late. So what I'm going to do is just give an overview of the seminar series and do some kind of general housekeeping before I hand over to Kateryna, who's going to introduce today's theme of food and agriculture and the speakers. So as a network, the Ukrainian Environmental Humanities Network, we're broadly interested in elevating works of research and art and general conversations regarding ecological issues in Ukraine. And these issues have been drawn into sharp focus since the full-scale invasion began last February, and even more so by the Kharkovka Dam catastrophe of recent weeks. So inspired by a range of Ukrainian and other scholars who've begun to define the field of Ukrainian environmental humanities, some of which are going to be speaking as part of this seminar series in the coming months, we felt as a group that the time was right to kind of have these discussions publicly and openly to raise awareness of these issues and to support those who are working on them from various different aspects. So as a network and a group, we're only just kind of beginning to figure out what we can do. And we planned some future events like film screenings and exhibitions. We plan to do some writing together, organize some residencies, but we're very open and so welcome anyone to join and get in touch. And if you have any ideas for collaboration, please do write to us. Several people have already done so, and we're kind of having conversations to see what we can make happen. So we really do envisage this network as thoroughly interdisciplinary and collaborative, and hope to bring ecologists into conversation with geographers, artists, with journalists, and curators, with anthropologists, to really bridge the gap between the social and the natural sciences, but also between academia and art. So the seminar series, we have to say that we're very grateful to several people who've enabled us to do this. So IZOLYATSIA, the Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, the New Democracy Fund by the Danish Cultural Institute, and the Ukrainian Institute in London have all been super brilliant in supporting this work and helping to promote and run this seminar series. And we partnered with the Department of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Warsaw and the Institute for East European Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. So we're very grateful to these people and hope these conversations that we're promoting can contribute to the emergence of new networks and research and activism and art in various ways. So before I hand over to Kateryna, I just want to let everyone know that the session today is being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel afterwards. So if anyone has any issues, write to us directly and we can work it out. If anyone, including the speakers, needs to leave for any reason during the talks, especially people in Ukraine, then do so without hesitation. And finally, to keep updated on the rest of the seminars in the series and what we'll be doing in the future, make sure you follow us on Twitter and Instagram and send us an email. I can add you to our mailing list. So I'll pass over to Kateryna, and I'm really grateful to the speakers for joining us today. Looking forward to hearing what you've got.
Hello, my name is Kateryna Aliinyk. My colleague Alexandra Progimniak and I will be chairing today's seminar. As Johnny already said, this is second seminar of our series. And today we're going to speak about food and agriculture. Let me make a small introduction to the topic. Ukraine, often referred to as a breadbasket of Europe, plays a crucial role in exporting agricultural products, particularly grain, to European countries and beyond. Its agricultural capabilities can be attributed to several factors, with the fertile black soil Chernozem standing out as one of them. Ukrainian culture is deeply rooted in the interconnection between its people, the soil, and the local environment. This interconnection became a platform for cultural and economic growth and facilitated the formation of the idea of Ukrainianness, which was historically persecuted by the Soviet regime and resulted in the politics of forceful collectivization, purges, and man-made famine Holodomor. The RDO cooking sections will focus on the financialization of Chernozem soil, the implications of extensive farming, and alternative human-soil relationships through their project Climavore. The invasion of the Soviet successor, Russian Federation, in 2014, and the subsequent full-scale invasion in 2022 once again disrupted the Ukrainian people's deep-rooted connection to their land, sparkling discussions on food security, the economic implications of Ukraine's agricultural sector, and the need for building a resilient future. During our second presentation, Natalia Mamonova will discuss coping strategies and solidarity initiatives in rural Ukraine during the full-scale war in Russia. And during our first presentation, Kateryna Aliinyk will take us on a journey examining the profound impact of war on domestic shores, land, and food throughout 9 years of occupation. Before handing it to Sasha, I would like to let you know that there is a Q&A window, which is on the bottom of your Zoom window. Please don't hesitate to write your questions. As soon as you have them, we're gonna answer all questions in the end of the session after all 3 presentations.
Thank you for introduction, for giving the introduction. My name is Alexandra Pogrebnyak, and I co-moderate this seminar together with Kateryna. I would like to briefly mention that we will start today with Kateryna Aliinyk's presentation, then Natalia Mamonova and cooking section will be our last presentation. So yeah, please let me introduce our participants, and we are very happy to have all of you with us here today. So Kateryna Aliinyk is a Ukrainian artist born in Luhansk and living and working mostly in Kyiv, but also around Europe now, participating in different residencies and exhibitions. So Kateryna mostly works with topics of war and occupation of Donbas, her home region, and she works through the images of nature, but given its non-anthropocentric optics. So she had a master's degree in painting from Kyiv National Academy of Fine Arts and Architecture in Kyiv, and painting still remains one of her main mediums, together with drawings and text. Parallel and after her academic education, she participated in some contemporary art educational courses and also artistic residencies. I would just mention Method Fund among them, but there are much more of them. And among her recent exhibitions, what is depicted here, and Working Room by Асортиментна кімната in Ivano-Frankivsk, State of Emergence, and Heart of Earth, which happened in Kyiv. Kateryna, can you please continue with our second participant?
Should I start or what?
Yeah, please start. I think we can introduce participants here.
Okay, yeah, so we go with the flow. Kateryna, then your work, the word is yours, and we are excited to hear more about your artistic research and artistic work.
Okay, I will share my screen. How to? Sorry. Okay, I see. So, hi everyone. I will accompany my talk with photos of my works in paintings, mostly from a cycle of close-ups on the Donbas soil, which I was making for last 2 years and recently finished. Since the topic of our seminar is food and agriculture, I would like to start by mentioning our with Natasha Chichasova book, Collective Fantasies and Eastern Resources, which includes both. And in this book, 2 of us choose, without previous negotiation, to tell our stories of losing home through our relationship with local food, nature, and landscape. By the way, it will soon be published in English, thanks to Dmytro Chupurny and Kateryna Aliinyk. And at first, it was surprising and not really clear why exactly gardening and food preservation connects us in talking about war and occupation. Because Donbas tends to be seen as a powerful industrial region throughout the history of Ukraine. but there is, of course, a huge agricultural side to it. And garden labor is a huge part of life for the majority of people, not only there, but around Ukraine. So choosing images of a landscape and agriculture in the war frame, for me, is also tightly connected to the reason why some people decided to stay in newly formed unrecognized republics back in 2014. And mostly, of course, it relates to elderly people. Before 2014, it often was not seen as a valid reason, but after 24th of the February, when millions of people around Ukraine were also faced with making this decision, it became more clear that not all decisions to stay are about politics. Most of the time, it's about things like attachment to the land and soil, inability to leave your home in which you put so much effort and have rooted there. And this bond sometimes is so strong that it's beyond logic or safety. I cannot tell for everyone, of course, because I tell mostly for me and my family's experience, because my practice is very highly connected to it. And here I think really good fits Simone Weil's words. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It is one of the hardest to define. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain expectations for the future. And also this point I mentioned about making decisions, I will elaborate a little bit later. Because we talk and hear a lot about collective experiences, but I think when personal ones are extracted and reviewed closely, it's always easier to relate and understand. So I started my serious medical and political fantasy about Luhansk in 2021, in which I tried to address all mutations and transformations happening these years on the other side of the border. Using images of soil and plants was a metaphor for not so visible and slow violence that creeps into the spheres of everyday life and stays there. Like how it is to maintain private patches of land on occupied territories when it's almost the last area of control over someone's lives. Like last year, my grandfather planted some special kind of grapes in Luhansk, and it will be ready in a few years, like he said, exactly for Ukraine's victory. So when I come home, everything will be in the best shape. And gardening as an activity in such circumstances perfectly shows how people try to stay civil in an uncivil society. And we tend to see our relationships with the landscape, especially from the one from our childhood, as more permanent, indestructible than relationships with people. And when this connection is interrupted, to say it feels surreal is to say nothing. And in our book, I mentioned that at Documenta 15, there was a video work about Armenians who were expelled from their lands, and all they left with was only songs about the stolen landscape, about the memory of the mountain's beauty, the valleys full of walnut trees, and the impossibility of coming back. But I had the chance to visit my hometown at least 5 times after occupation. And it led me to the bitter truth and difference in our Ukrainian situation, where our landscape can be stolen even if we can see it or theoretically have access to it. And on my way to Luhansk, I always thought, why does this landscape look so scary, even if it looks almost the same, even better somewhere? Probably because beneath this flourishing greenery, we most likely will find evidences of war crimes. And it is scary because inside the soil, the distance between all atrocities, there were many of them happening on lands of Eastern Ukraine during at least the last 100 years is too short. And here came for me the topic of the optic of zoomed, distorted, or subterranean images. And in my paintings, I try to convey that at first glance, landscape where no one ventures anymore can appear to undergo a revival, because people have stopped visiting. But my main point was that even if a landscape does not seem to retain traces of tragedy for long, in the end, a closer look usually reveals its presence. Artillery warfare, landmines and blood change the soil significantly over time. Liquids of war seeping into the soil. Even in agricultural spaces, landmines, wreckage from rockets and human remains still forcibly coexist alongside edible plants. Eastern and southern Ukraine are also well known for the most fertile soil. For 9 years already, it's also well known for being destroyed the most by Russians. And this overlap reminds that every battlefield is just a field in the first place. And Ukrainians still try their best to preserve their original purpose despite everything. But now we are all worried whether the harvest is edible, or had we just lost our appetites? Are the traces on the ground from agricultural or war vehicles? And lots of other questions we must think about on a daily basis, constantly expecting danger. It's very common in Ukraine to own a patch of land. And for people who are not farmers in the first place, gardening is mostly a therapeutic activity. And for some people in war times, it actually became even more therapeutic, and produce from it became somehow symbolic. Exactly at the time of regular visit in occupied Luhansk to help with harvesting and preservation, I also noticed that domestic labor, especially working in the gardens, which for many people were the reason to stay, became one of the tools of resistance through maintaining normal life while waiting for liberation. Such activities like watering roses and tomatoes between shellings or taking domestic animals to the bomb shelters back in 2014 with my family were all about kindness and care, not only to each other, but also to non-humans. No surprise that during the wartime, acts of service also became one of the strongest and valid love languages. I talk about these shifts because solidarity and compassion in such circumstances really shown themselves in full scale, like constantly busting our guts out with my mom to bring local produce to Kyiv, because it was the most desirable souvenir for people from Luhansk who live in Kyiv. And in our book with Natasha, we totally don't know a limit to our sentiments connected with the taste of local sweet cherries or potatoes that seem to grow already salty because Donbas soil is rich with salt. And coming back again to our with Natasha's book, now it can be seen very clearly why we decided to talk about our loss through making links between domestic labor, food, gardening, and helping our close ones in general. Also, while discussing everything with Natasha, our similar but different stories, I really understood how physical destruction of people, houses, fields, and cities leads to another destruction. Loss of family and region history, loss of local dialects, loss of access to memories, loss of knowledge about fruits and vegetables, preservation, specifics of cultivation of certain types of soil. This, as well as other components of non-material heritage, might be lost forever. But in some ways, so does an abandonment or neglectance. What I mean is that during the wartime, we found ourselves in a paradoxical situation where in the end there is no right decision to make. Every scenario except for peace includes losing something big. And at this point, everyone decides what values the most, what you want to preserve. Because staying means loss of agency, living means letting all your property and belongings to be ruined by neglectance or misappropriated by someone else. My garden probably doesn't need me anymore, but every week while talking to my grandparents via FaceTime, we discuss only what was planted, what has sprouted, and never war itself. But it is very much present, even in such innocent chatting about gardening, fruits and vegetables. The war already significantly changed our relationship with nature. We saw how vulnerabilities and deals with consequences on the same level. We lost a lot of it. Even if some parts of it are restored quickly, others will suffer for decades more. And after the victory, We will have to learn how to interact with nature and its resources in a new way, because after everything happening, old ways probably will not work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kateryna, for your incredible presentation. I just saw somebody's hand raised. I just want to remind you that please write your questions in Q&A window, which is on the bottom of the Zoom window. And our next presentation is by Natalia Mamonova. Natalia Mamonova is a senior researcher at Ruralis Institute of Rural Regional Research, Norway. Her research focuses on rural politics, agrarian transformation, social movements, food sovereignty, and right-wing populism in post-socialist rural Europe. She received her PhD degree from Erasmus University, the Netherlands, in 2016. Since then, she was a researcher, lecturer at the University of Oxford, the New Europe College in Bucharest, the University of Helsinki, and the Stockholm Center of Eastern European Studies. Her current research, Ruralis, is primarily focused on the impact of the war in Ukraine on the Ukrainian and global food systems. Natalia, we're happy to have you today.
Right, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for the introduction. And it's actually quite difficult emotionally for me right now to talk after Kateryna's presentation, because I was so moved by the images and the words that you said. So I will do the more academic way, and we'll try maybe also to have a little bit of my personal stories through that. Yes, should be working now. Yeah, so the title of my presentation, the Food Sovereignty and Solidarity Initiatives in Rural Ukraine During the War. And before I start, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the situation in agriculture in Ukraine. It's largely represented by bimodal structure that consists of two different types of agricultural producers. It's large-scale industrial agricultural companies, and also known often as agro holdings, that cultivate about half of Ukrainian land and contribute to about half of gross domestic agricultural output. They specialized mostly on grain production, primarily for export. Another half is produced by small holdings and farmers that are specialized in such labor-consuming produce as potatoes, vegetables, and fruits, berries, honey, meat and milk products. And they are also equally contribute to half of gross domestic agricultural output, as I said, and cultivate half of Ukrainian land. Land belongs to Ukrainian people largely at this particular moment because of moratorium on land sales, and large firms are renting the land shares from rural population. That's what was before the war. And the interesting thing in academic debates is that why the smallholders and family farmers are not the prominent form of agricultural production in Ukraine, even so they are so productive and they're so important in food security of the country. And moreover, why the ideas of food sovereignty, as defined as the rights of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced in ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the rights to define their own food systems, why these food sovereignty ideas are not so popular in Ukraine, while the smallholders are actually, in fact, producing that healthy and culturally appropriate food. And different theories are made to explain it. One of the major explanation is that food self-provisioning is seen as a natural order of things, and small-scale farming is perceived as a backward and inefficient and relic of the Soviet past, and not only by the policymakers and big agribusiness, but also by the producers themselves. And for me, it was interesting to see the transformation in this discourse after the Euromaidan revolution. And this is the first paper I have written on transformation of the ways how the people talk about small-scale farming in Ukraine. I did research in 2000 2012 and 2016, just like 2 years before and 2 years after the Euromaidan revolution. And I saw the drastic transformation actually in the way how people perceive their small-scale food production. If in the past it was indeed seen as something backwards that might disappear in the future, now more and more people look at it as a sustainable alternative to neoliberal agricultural model, and the way that Ukrainian food production should develop forward towards a more European way of farming. And this was present in Ukraine already before the full-scale war. And when the war started, I was in Stockholm. I was with my family, and it was a call from my cousin who from Zhytomyr, who said that the war started. I were not able to find a place for myself, and for weeks and maybe months, and all the things I've done, I felt like it was not meaningful enough, because, you know, by protesting in front of Russian embassy in Stockholm, you will not stop the war. But then the editor of Journal of Peasant Studies contacted me and asked me if I can write something on Ukraine, if I can. And I said yes, and I thought it's a good idea to actually direct my emotions into something productive and something that I can contribute as much as I can as an academic. And I have written, and it was recently published, a paper on the food sovereignty and solidarity initiative in rural Ukraine during the war. It was based on the interviews with my family, with my former informants. I did field work in Ukraine many times, and then I kept in contact with many people in the countryside. So I called them and I asked them to share their stories and how they experienced the war and how it impacted their farming and food production. And of course, I expected that the war will further boost this patriotic sentiments about the food, and that the Ukrainian farming, the small-scale farming, is the one that fits Ukraine and is the future of Ukraine. I expected that, but besides that, I found much more findings that I would like to share with you today. So as I mentioned earlier, I think before the recording started, that I was born in Zhytomyr, and this is most of the data is coming from for this research. This is the people whom I interviewed, and this is where I had the most of the contacts, and as well from Kyiv region, of course. And Zhytomyr is a very well-developed agricultural region. Both large farms and small farms exist there, and it borders in Belarus. And during the air bombing, most of their rockets are flying from Belarus. In fact, it was not under the long time occupation by the Russian army. It was in the last spring, just for a few weeks, and 7 villages of Zhytomyr region were occupied, but they were quickly liberated. There's a lot of processes that are taking place there. Of course, they can't be compared to the processes that take place in the areas of the actual military, the hostilities, but there's a quite representative as well. So quickly, the impact on agriculture. I will go very quickly on that, because I think all of you have read, and if you're interested in this topic, what are the impact. So yes, there is a lot of shelling of that fall on agricultural objects, and especially the large farms are suffering because they're important objects, strategic objects, and they're Russian Federation using the food as a weapon of the war as well, and the attacks on a large-scale export-oriented agriculture in Ukraine is one of the examples, and the blockade of the ports. Of course, you all know that that created a food crisis in the whole world. So you see that here's the damages of livestock and poultry sheds, and it's not a military objects, and obviously. This is the fields that are covered with craters from the rockets and bombs. And it's not only that it's dangerous to cultivate in the land and during the war, but also we may talk about this later. It has a huge impact on the soil and on groundwaters, and it poisoned it with heavy metals and other chemicals. Then also there is examples of burning field crops, and especially during the harvest. And last autumn we saw a lot of pictures how the wheat was set on fire next to their areas of active hostilities. That's how their fields look like after the farmers managed to slow down the fire. And it was, I don't have this picture, but there were few videos even online when there's the farmer with a tractor just drives through the fire, and with a plugging addition, it's making the soil open in order to stop the fire. It's only one way to do that. Then also when the war started, especially in the beginning, there was a serious shortage of fertilizers, seeds, and fuel. Of course, most of the fertilizers and fuels came from Belarus and Russia, and when the war started, all their supplies were shut off. Especially, I want to say a few words about the fertilizers, because just before the war, the Ukraine made a law that requires some certification of fertilizers, and so the big companies managed to get these certificates in order to store the fertilizer. Oh, sorry, fertilizer, I'm completely right now around the fuel. I was talking all about the fuel. So that before the war, there was a certification of the fuel storages, but smallholders and small family farmers were not able to obtain those certificates, and they had just a few, did not so much fuel left on their fields. And when the war started, they devoted the last fuel, diesel, primarily to the needs of the Ukrainian army, because tanks and military machinery runs on diesel, so as tractors and agricultural machines do. Then also the remaining fuel that was left in Ukraine is also often attacked from the air. Here we see the explosion of the oil depot in Zhytomyr, and my cousin was seeing that, and she said it was like in daytime and night. It became a night, so that black smoke covered the entire sky. Labor shortages as well. Many people were called to the front, and many women left the Ukraine. As we know, there are up to 9 million refugees now in Europe. Some of them returned, and first people who were called to the front were the farmers and operators of the large machineries, agricultural machines, because they are those who can help really on the front. And another thing is about 7 to 10% different estimations. It's very difficult to say exactly the numbers of the farmland. The farmland is mined, and Ukrainian sapeur brigades working together with local communities and trying to demine it as fast as possible. So despite all these things, and still their last year harvest was quite successful. And the question is, how did they do this, and how different agriculture producers managed to go through these challenges? And here I will give you the quote of one of my informants, and she's an academic from Ukrainian Academy of Science, and she's also activist of Ukrainian Rural Development Network. And she said, I quote, unfortunately, I have the not full screen, so I can't really see the whole text, but that the large farm enterprises, large agri-holdings, they collapse as a colossus with the feet of clay. When the logistic chains were broken, even those agri-holdings that were outside of areas of active hostilities were unable to cultivate their lands. Their supply chains were destroyed. They store pesticides and seeds in Warren House near Kiev, and as they have cars and tractors in another place. Their workforce is a traveling brigade that do not hire local population, but move their teams of professional machine operators from one region to another. When the war began, they were unable to carry on with their business because they could not manage the logistics. The last point is this: it was a blocking of their ports and an ability to sell their products. And at the same time, the small farmers were quite flexible and mobile. They used horse-drawn transport, manual labor. They shared shared fuel if they had it. So despite everything, farmers managed to plug their fields and sow. End quote. And this is also not only about the two different modes of production, this large versus small, but also that ability of smallholders to find their substitutes of their inputs that they are missing, the ability to help each other. And more and more people talking about smallholders and small family farmers as those who feed Ukraine during the war, who were able to guarantee the food security and who are the true heroes of the war. And they're not only the produce of food, they are heroes in many other places. This is, I just given an example of one of the cabbage farmer who found the rocket shell in his field, and this is the face of the heroes. And here I would quote Mykola Strizhak. He's a former president of Association of the Farmers and Private Landowners of Ukraine. And he says that what confirms my argument about the heroism of farmers is that family farmers are real war heroes. With one hand, they sow and harvest. With others, they help the army organize territorial defense and receive refugees. They are very patriotic. They speak the national language, adhere to national cultures and traditions, stand up for their country, not like large agro-holdings. Those are only interested in making money. And end quote. So their territorial defense is like when they set up checkpoints, posts, and control who is coming and live in the village. They help to evacuate local residents when the Russians advance, and they do receive refugees indeed, because the rural areas are safer in comparison to the cities. As we hear from the news and we know from our friends that the largest cities are the targets of the attacks, while the countryside, of course, is dangerous, but maybe it's less dangerous. So many urban dwellers now move to their friends, family who live in the countryside, who their country houses, dachas, or just come there and received by community and got a place to stay. And it's very common in Ukraine. And it's also changed the whole spectrum of relationship between rural dwellers and the newcomers. And here I would cite you Anastasia Volkova, who is one of the organizers of Green Road Initiative. It was an initiative of the network, of Eco-Village network, that initially aimed to provide a temporary location for people who want to, who are fleeing their war zones and on their way to the western part or to the Europe. But for many people, these locations and temporary locations become the permanent locations, and their eco-villages and villages in general start growing and revitalizing in such a way. And also that what she said about the conflicts that used to be in the past, but not anymore. I quote, Our eco-village is located in an ordinary village. When the переселенцы settlers, that's how they call them, internally displaced persons, when the переселенцы began to arrive, we received them in our homes, as locals did. Together we went to register переселенцы at the village council. Before the war, villagers were skeptical of us. In their eyes, we were strange people who grow weeds in the garden, do not farm in the usual industrial ways, do not eat meat, do not drink horilka. But here we are on equal footing. Our women, together with the local village women, bake pies for the needs of the army. Our men, along with the locals, went to harvest. It helped us to get closer. And there's a lot of different other examples, and I don't have time to talk about all the examples of solidarity initiatives in Ukraine, but just give you a few pictures that Anastasia shared with me and how the locals working together with переселенцы. Here they are preparing the vegetable beds, and here they're installing their glass house that they bought based on the donations. Here they're renovating their abandoned rural house, and the right upper corner you see how the typical abandoned rural house look like, and you see how the they renovated. And in Ukraine, especially in the villages that far away from the centers, and there are serious problems with depopulation, and many houses stay abandoned, stay closed. And what my respondents were telling me is that now almost every house, almost every abandoned house that is possible to use is used. So they even saw the reason for this inflow of the people to the countryside is very dramatic and very sad. It in fact brought the life back to many abandoned rural areas. Here they're delivering the fridge to one of the family of the переселенцы, and here they're distributing the local food. And so there's in my article I say that indeed all this war brought in and strengthened the discourse on the importance of small-scale food and production and local food networks, and the food sovereignty actually exists and it's strongly articulated, but there is not the term is not used. And in fact, there is a food sovereignty movement in Ukraine, which is a member of an European food sovereignty movement, the Rural Development Network, but they don't use the food sovereignty term in their politics. And so that's here I cite again Olena, she says that it's too scary not too scary term to use, because it requires to talking about a drastic transformation, almost revolution, and Ukraine is too tired of that revolution that is now. And perhaps I would skip this, because this is a description of what the Ukrainian Rural Development Network has done, and it did a lot of good things. And hopefully it will be able to push forward the agenda for small-scale farming in Ukraine further during the war and post-war recovery. But the conflict between large and small still exists and still is vital, but it's now seen as a way, like that Ukraine still can win even that battle. And here I finish with a cite of Mykola Strizhak, and he says how he sees the future. He says, I quote, "Our children, our boys will return from the front. We will win the war and our boys will return. We will break the backbone of the Russian army. And then we farmers will make everything work. We'll defend our rights and the future. Will be easy? I don't think so. The big feudal lords," is how he calls the agro holdings, "will not live without a fight, but we can fight," end quote. And here, let me finish. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation. We will continue with next presentation by cooking section. It's UK-based artistic duo established in London in 2013 by Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alan Schwabe. So the collective examines the systems that organize the world through food, use insight, responsive installations, performance, and video, and other mediums, including participatory projects, which we will speak more about. So they practice, in their practice, they're using food as a lens, but also as a tool to observe landscapes in their transformation. And since 2015, they have worked on multiple iterations of long-term site-responsive project called Climavore. This project explores how humans are changing climate through their food practices and what they eat. Cooking sections were nominated for Turner Prize in 2021 for their project Salmon, a Red Herring, and also nominated for Visible Award for socially engaged practices. But what we're really proud about that they were participants of Future Generation Art Prize in 2019 and did their project in Kyiv, in Ukraine. So the project was called Climavore, for the right of the soil not to be exhausted. My colleague Kateryna already mentioned that Chernozem is a very important issue in this conversation about climate issues and also questions connected to food supply chains. So that's very valuable an important project in this site. And yeah, so their work have been exhibited internationally in major institutions, including Tate Britain, Serpentine Gallery, and many others. They were also participants of Taipei Biennial, 58th Venice Biennial, Istanbul Biennial, Shanghai Biennial, and many other important international events. So the word is yours, and thank you for participation.
Thank you. So I'm Alon, I'm part of cooking sections, and yeah, as was introduced, this is a kind of a revisiting of a project we did back in 2019. So Climavore for the Rights of the Soil Not to Be Exhausted was first presented as an art installation looking at the appreciation for fertility at the Pinchuk Art Center, Kiev, in winter 2019. We put together an archive of soil-related artifacts, sifting through Neolithic Trypillian cultures, the conquering of virgin land, the commodification of chromosome, the engineering of extreme weather-resistant grains, and the ongoing financialization of agri-holding interests. Climavore is a framework we created in 2015 as a research platform, an agency, and a movement to question how to eat if humans are changing climate. And in the case of the project we developed in Kiev, it followed the transformation of fertile ground and the powers that have made seeds, soils, and souls to exhaustion. It's important also for us to mention that in the light of the recent full-scale Russian invasion and the war in Ukraine, some of the information that we're presenting here might be a bit outdated, as some of the field work that we conducted back then and in-person conversations that we had during the time could not continue. Please bear with us and let us know if there's more recent events, especially about the current status of the seed law that should be updated.
So we just wanted to talk about Chernozem and the different kind of powers and structures that have been, in a way, using the fertility narrative around Chernozem and that kind of black soil. And we'd like to start with this episode, which happened in November 2011, when Ukrainian environmentalist Oleg Peregon reported soil thieves had dug out a 2-meter deep layer of black soil of Chernozem across 10 hectares of a field in Pisochin, Kharkiv.
Over the past decades, local newspapers increasingly have been filled with ads selling Chernozem, a unique deep and black substrate renowned for its fertility, of which Ukraine counts to have 25% of the world reserves.
Either for domestic use or shipped to replace the grounds in a way of the highest global bidder, Chernozem could be found for sale on roadsides and online trading platforms.
Soil dealers not only strip fertility away from the barren soil, which will need centuries to recover. The voids that are also used as illegal landfills for extra income have many similar cases throughout Ukraine in different regions that all take advantage of uncultivated land or fields owned by pensioners with no heirs. Chernozem prices are seasonal, low in spring and summer, and costing about a ton of soil could cost between $80 to $100. And at high season in the fall and winter, the price can spike up to $150 to $180 per ton of soil.
As part of the project that we exhibited at Pinchuk in 2019, we were looking also into different land struggles in Ukraine that run deep in the ground, from the tall grass prairies and how they flourished with Chernozem as much as Chernozem flourished with its inhabitants. And since the Neolithic, these Trypillian matriarchal societies were based on steppe agriculture, baked bread, and worshipped soil fertility through rituals like making breadcrumb, also heads for these kind of clay figurines. And these, for us, what is important is that these early semi-nomadic societies did not just stumble upon fertile grounds. They were flourishing societies that built soil and were built by it. And both Trypillian prairies and houses were even set in flames in cycles to nourish the ground, and similar to the making of soil in the Amazon called a terra preta. And this careful cultivation and over millennia in a way constructed the terrain as a global silo that is now besieged to extract even more productivity. But as Christina Lyons reminds us in Vital Decomposition, defining soil as fertile and productive can also fuel a market-oriented, human-centered notion of productivity that should not erase other values and practices that made soil into what it is.
Therefore, modern appreciation and exploitation of Ukrainian journalism dates back to the earliest 18th century, when the Russian Tsar Catherine II pushed people and policies into the steppe colonies, turning them into universal breadbaskets. Intensively cultivated by imported laborers, grain was carted to Odessa, shipped through Istanbul and the Bosphorus Strait, onwards to the rest of Europe and the Americas. From there, as railways shortened time and distance, the newly created futures markets, grain bonds, and bills of exchange further boosted financial instruments, making wheat into the flour of European and American 19th century imperialism, eventually displacing Russia from the global grain markets.
Competition between Russia, Europe, and America did not stop these unimaginable quests. And so appreciating Chernozem soil and the utopia of transplanting fertility to any possible territory opened up new frontiers. In the 1930s, a notable episode involved 78 degrees north that relied on soil mining in the steppes to feed iron miners in the Arctic. Owned by the Russian state company Arctic Ural, the mining pyramid was operated by 1,000 settlers that, like the soil, had been shipped from Ukraine. And in the springtime, a large artificial lawn that you see here in the photograph was actually bursting with colorful flowers and green grasses and even Ukrainian worms and other invertebrates transplanted with the soil still thrive in Svalbard in the Arctic. Today, this northernmost statue of Lenin in long-abandoned Pyramiden stands frozen in time as the last witness of the tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, and peppers once grown in the soil transplanted from its origins.
As the Arctic was being settled, the pressure to feed the people of the Soviet Union led to collectivized farms, replacing local staples with modern engineered grains and cash crops, such as sugar beet and cotton. And this kind of transformation in history and how it kind of reshaped the territory of Ukraine is very important to acknowledge. Prioritizing the Soviet mother state over the needs of Ukrainian population, the confiscation of peasant grain led to the Holodomor famine between 1932 and 1933, when over 7 million starved to death following orders from Moscow.
As dead bodies piled up in the streets, especially health moved into the basement of the Bessarabka market that you see here in the image, where corpses were temporarily stored in the refrigerated cellars. And these underground rooms went from storing the city's nourishment to housing those who had succumbed to human-made famine by the Soviet Union.
Extraordinary modern grains required extraordinary amounts of chemical, which over time resulted in a third of the planet's topsoil severely degraded by intensive farming, pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, and industrial fertilizers. A result of surplus ammonium nitrate explosives repurposed to combat food scarcity after World War II. Over 500 million tons of soil is today subjected to erosion and low fertility, unable to retain stormwater and subject to imminent collapse. Modern wheat breeding was believed to be responsible for the increase in celiac disease, but overdose of nitrogen fertilizer in soils has also boosted gluten content in wheat, increasing celiac-specific symptoms in gluten-sensitive individuals. Therefore, hyperfertility has crippled bodies as well as landscapes throughout the season of soil exhaustion. Over the last 30 years, the amount of landslide in Ukraine has actually tripled. In the Odessa region alone, 5,000 landslide-prone sites occupy the fifth of the territory, with a surface of 66 square kilometers already eaten by soil schists as of September 2018. Gullies now appear across the country, which reflect the heritage of Soviet monoculture and neoliberal land tenure. Since the 1990s, international agribusiness have advocated an expansion of intensification of cultivation. Fear of farmers' dispossession, fueled by the ghosts of the Holodomor, led to a law in 2001, as was mentioned earlier, that banned sales of fertile land. Barred from buying and selling, average Ukrainian owners relied on subsistence farming while lessening the risk to bigger operators. Since most of the land has been leased to third parties, often under predatory terms, the moratoria eventually enhanced even more agrochemical toxicity, needed to achieve high yields in the short term before moving on to exhausted fields elsewhere. So this is not a result of climate change and increased periods of drought. Human geopolitical interventions on the land and on infrastructure are very palpable. Here we can see how fields were irrigated until 2016, thanks to the Northern Crimean Canal, and how the fields died out after the water flow to water-dependent Crimea was interrupted. In March 2020, President of Ukraine, Zelensky, signed the law on the circulation of agricultural land, officially ending the 20-year land sale ban. Pushed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to liberalize the market, the law 552-IX unlocked the purchase of thousands of fields, despite 64% of Ukrainians being against the creation of a land market for multiple reasons. Small-scale farmers already struggling with debt foresaw the new unaffordable land prices. Ahead of the end of the land sales moratoria, pro-Russia's voices like Opposition Platform for Life tried to paralyze the law and its clauses prohibiting Russian citizens and firms from buying land in Ukraine by introducing more than 4,000 amendments. For some, the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine is part of a market transition from oil to soil, as climate change is disrupting 3/4 of Russia's Arctic North, and Western powers are increasingly reluctant about buying its fossil fuels, half of Russia's exports. It's perhaps not a coincidence that Eastern Ukraine is also home to the bulk of the most productive Chernozem, which could diversify Russia's economy while capitalizing on investments on food security. The exclusion of Russian investment from the new fertility market is seemingly an ingredient in the war mix over the annexation of flourishing soils. And so Russia retaliated. Since the occupation of the Chernozem-rich territories started on the 23rd of February 2022 in the eastern Ukraine, over 40,000 hectares of the land lost by harvests, for instance, have allegedly been seized by Russian agribusiness AgroComplex, which controls over 800,000 hectares of land in Russia, and is headed by oligarch and former Russian agriculture minister, Alexander Tkachev. Valuing Chernozem is a process intensified by land grabs and agro-holding businesses, toppled by soil exhaustion after centuries of overtilling. The current war is yet another wave of fertility loss, not only in terms of ownership, but also, as mentioned before, bomb shellings has also upset delicate ecosystems of microorganisms that turn soil into crop nutrients, such as nitrogen, while tanks have compressed the earth, making it harder for roots to flourish. Some areas are so mined and transformed by craters and trenches that, like some World War I battles, may never return to yielding lands. Academic Joseph Huppy and Randall Schatzel coined the term bomb turbation to describe war's impact on multiple soil horizons. Citizens fear that these indelible war scars will only deepen with creditors' requirements in the reconstruction efforts, the next financial struggle that will determine soil fertility. In December 2022, a coalition of farmers, academics, and NGOs desperately called on the Ukrainian government to suspend the land reform law and all land transactions during and after the war in order to guarantee national security and territorial integrity. Amid national discussion on the land reform prior to the passing of the land sale moratorium, our 2019 exhibition took place in the basement of the Bessarabka market, where we opened room 31 to the public and let the soil speak. We collaborated with lawyers Olga Bessarabka and Maria Schenkendret to ground the legal framework for a future where the soil holds an inherent right not to be exhausted and sustain life for generations to come. During the exhibition, the legal amendment draft to Ukrainian Land Code was discussed through a series of soil talks that unpacked some of these topics. Guests were invited to taste 3 Climavore recipes baked in collaboration with Kiev-based Shilib and Son. The loaves included no-till bread made with corn and lentils, oats, sunflower seeds, and flax seeds, mustard seeds, and honey. Polyculture bread made with a mix of evolutionary population of wheat, and forever fertile bread made with a rotation of untoasted buckwheat groats, pumpkins, flax, and sunflower seeds. Altogether, the installation laid the ground for an understanding of the exhaustion of Ukrainian soil amidst its shifting climatic frontier and war over fertile grounds. Thank you.